Hello, James Moffat here. Please go to parentingadultchildren.org website and sign up for a free membership and leave a review for this episode. If you have any requests for future topics, send me an email at talkpac@proton.me. That's talkpac@proton.me. Please share this podcast with your friends and family. Now for today's guest interview.
Welcome to the podcast ABCs of Parenting Adult Children. Please join us as we discuss parenting adult children and the unique struggles that it comes along with.
Hello and welcome to Parenting Adult Children podcast. My name is James Moffat and I'll be your host. Today we have a guest speaker by the name of David Ask. David, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
What's up? Yeah, I'm doing great today. Thanks.
So I'm glad you're here today, and I always love having men or dads on the show because dads always bring a different, unique perspective to the role of parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've said before in other episodes, moms and dads love their kids equally, I think, and moms tend to be the primary caregivers in the home. Some moms stay at home, they homeschool, or they're just more actively involved in the day to day activities of homemaking, taking care of the kiddos. And dads are a little bit more for those who maybe provide more of the discipline and set boundaries and guidance and provide the guardrails and help to prepare the children for the real world, right? And we all know that once you step outside the front door, little Johnny's just not as special to everybody as he is to us, right? And sometimes the world's a little bit on the hard side. Reality sets in and they're like, oh wow, this is nothing like what I had at home.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm glad that you can provide a dad's perspective. And I'm just gonna read this little profile that you have on Podmatch. It says exploring identity and authenticity. David Ask brings insights into fostering resilience and grit in young adults and their families. The episode could discuss how a deep understanding of personal identity transforms parenting strategies.
Yeah. It's the funny thing. I've spent the last, I guess 6 years now, really digging into this idea of self-awareness and how do you, what does it look like to, to understand yourself and help someone else understand themselves, i.e. parenting, right?
Right.
I like that you use that term guardrails. And, it's obviously when children are younger, we provide those guardrails. But as they get older, what does it look like to provide internal guardrails so that they can, have that, that sense of, of confidence as they launch into the world? A good friend of mine, Dr. Andy Garrett, who I work with closely, he uses that clinical term self-actualization. And what does that really mean? You're basically, able at that point to have those internal guardrails to navigate life with. So, and James, I'm hearing some feedback here. Are you hearing that on your end?
No.
I'm hearing myself for some reason. That's kind of strange. Test
No,
1, 2.
you're only coming across on my earbuds.
Okay, that's strange. Anyway, let's keep going then. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I can actually cut this out, so I'll edit it with Riverside. So fathers. Well, I'll just back up and say that one of the recurring themes that we have here at the all our podcast episodes is failure to launch, boundaries, and all of that sort of stuff. There's about 30 of them. I can't name them off the top of my head, but boundaries is a very prevalent, important topic that we discuss because they're so important for not only the parents, but also for the children. And before our kids turn 18, we have a parent-child relationship with them, and then so we're very active in their day-to-day activities and enforcing boundaries, making sure they don't crash into the guardrails too hard. Then when they turn 18, they start becoming, between 18 and 26, they become adults, more and more so. They start maturing, and
Sure.
it seems like the female gender, they seem to their frontal lobe seems to mature a little bit faster than this guy's for
Yeah.
whatever reason.
Right. Yeah.
And we like to crash into the guardrails and flip over, as much as possible because it seems to be fun to us.
Right.
But anyhow, once they start becoming an adult, then we become a mentor and we become a support system, right? And obviously, once they become an adult, they can be like, I hear what you're saying, Dad, but I don't necessarily agree with it, and I may not actually follow that,
Yeah.
right? And so what we hope is that we have enough of a relationship with that new adult that there's respect has been baked into that relationship. The hopefully the new adult child uh will operate within the bounds of that respect and still listen to us and still come to us with their issues and problems and things that they're facing out in the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And like you said, I think it's that type of a relationship, needs to be cultivated for years. I again, Dr. Andy uses this phrase called, psychological safety. And I think it's more of this idea too of psychological respect. And what's fascinating though is I think that's generated quite often through the ability to be wrong and get through the weeds together.
Right.
I think that quite often when, teenagers are wrong and that kind of stuff, if they get shut down too many times and they don't feel like they can, they've got a safe place to process some of their thoughts and ideas and hormones and all the other stuff, right? Then they're just like, hey, I'm not going to go back to that well if that well is filled with, alligators. And, it's so the boundaries end up getting really, really messed up. There's no sense of, hey, we're on the same team here. Let's do this together. And let me give you rope, long enough so that you can't hang yourself, but yet you can, learn some things with still being safe too.
Yeah. And children and young adults want to be heard, and they want to be heard. They want to be seen, which means that fathers, especially fathers, they need to be present in their children's lives. They need to be there. There's another term that we talk about a lot: emotional resilience or emotional maturity. I'm not hitting the second word right. I'm not that emotional intelligence, right?
Oh yeah.
So the emotional intelligence needs to be the father and the mom. You got a husband, you got a wife, a mom and a dad, and the marriage relationship needs to be grounded and have a good foundation before the children come into the scene. Of course, we know that a lot of times we're all just growing up together. Moms and dads are growing up.
Sure.
We don't have a manual per se. They pat you on the head and give you a bag of diapers and send you out of the hospital and go, good luck.
Yeah.
They seem to be healthy. Good luck. And then when we have these fragile human beings that are, babies in the animal kingdom, human babies are the most fragile and most susceptible to danger than any of in the animal kingdom. So we have the awesome role of nurturing and feeding and protecting and raising these children. Katie and I have been married for, we're going on 35 years, and we raised 4 children, and
Right.
they're grown and gone, and we're empty nesters. Well, wait a minute. I have 2 dogs and 2 cats, so we're not really empty nesters, but our adult children don't live here anymore, and we're still in contact with 2 of them. Yeah, 2 of them. And so emotional intelligence, it's important that while we're trying to shape and form the minds and hearts of our adult children, we need to be cognizant of what's going on inside of us.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, James here, James Moffat. I wanted to let you know about our current sponsors. These people sponsor the podcast financially and help to underwrite the cost of producing this podcast. And I want to say thank you to them. So Michael Evan Blair is with whenindoubt.spinitout.com. Richard Jones is with secondstarts.com, addiction recovery program. Jonathan Nall, he's the author of Final Approach or finalapproach.com. Kenny Dupar, author of Scoundrels in Iraq. Scott Yamamura, author of Financial Epiphany. Mary Toko is a vocal advocate for vaccine education and parental rights. Andrew Ryan Profashi is a cult and cancer survivor and the author of The War on Love. Melissa Crook is a podcast guest and she is the insightful and compassionate host of the Feel, that's F.E.E.L podcast. All right. Thank you for listening to this. And now back to your feature presentation.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? Something you mentioned about boundaries, I'll revisit. I think that, something that dads, bring to the table is this idea of certainty. And again, I reference Dr. Andy because I've learned so much from him, and I work with him. But I asked him one time, because I'm working on a book called The Guardians of Grit for dads, and I asked him, I said, so what's the number one thing that a child needs, from their father? And he said, without hesitation, it's to remove as much uncertainty as possible, which I thought was a really fascinating thing, right? You would think it's protection, you would think it's love, and
Sure.
what's fascinating is if you actually look at kind of the umbrella, of uncertainty, right? Well, then it encompasses all of those things, right? The kids feel safe, they feel loved. There's no question mark around any of that. And what's fascinating too, though, is I think with regards to boundaries and so on, is I really believe that we are called to raise our children, and quite often I think there's probably a new paradigm in our culture, which I think is just complete nonsense. Is that, well, I'm going to let my children choose what they believe about X, Y, and Z, and on some really, really huge issues.
Right.
That doesn't mean, right, that we need to ram our beliefs down our kids' throat. But I really believe, as a father, I'll steal this from Seth Godin. He says, people like us do things like this. So I want my kids to know, as the leader of my family, we have an ethic that we live by.
Right.
People like
Right.
us do things like this.
Sure.
But here's the funny thing, right? They're going to ask why. And
Right.
as the dad, if I cannot back that up, well, come on. If you're going to say something is true, well, you better be able to back it up. And I believe there are absolute bedrock truths in this life that you can base your entire existence on. So when we remove as much uncertainty as possible, I want my kids to know by the time they leave my home, and I'm getting, we're going to be empty nesters in about 6 months. I want them to know full well, while they're self-actualizing, they can look back and see the consistent plumb line that dad operated his life through. And it's going to be such a stabilizing force. If they choose not to believe what I believe, well, that's on them, and that's okay, I guess. At the same time, I want to be extremely confident in what I believe and why I do the things that I do. And I think that brings so much stability to a family.
Yeah, as fathers, we kind of set the tone for what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
We totally set the tone. Absolutely.
And our role as fathers is that we help put those guardrails in place, and we communicate our heritage. I mean, I was raised in the 70s and 80s, and I didn't have a very healthy childhood.
Mm-hmm.
My sister and I were adopted in Germany. I was raised by a military family, and they were very authoritarian.
Yeah.
And don't do as I do, do as I say. Don't question me. We go to the relatives or go out in public. You sit with your hands in your lap, and you don't speak unless you're spoken to.
Yeah.
Yada yada yada. And so there was a lot of garbage there that I had to unlearn when I became a father.
Sure.
Right. And you're exactly right that whatever tone that you set, and whatever we, for a lack of better terminology, we pass our ethics and our morality onto our children. We define what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's right to love one another. It's right to respect one another. It's right to say, I'm sorry. It's right for me to discipline you when you make a mistake. And it's wrong for us to do anything different than that. It's wrong for the parents to make excuses, and it's wrong for us to say, I don't want you to do drugs, but yet they see mom and dad lighting up a doobie, at 6 o'clock in the evening, or drinking a beer and popping up their feet and flipping the channels on the TV and being emotionally non-existent, being absent from our children's lives, and that's where the terminology latchkey children, I guess it was 50s, 60s, and 70s when that was such a prominent phenomenon, because mom and dad were out of the house working, making money to pay the bills and put food on the table. And the kids had keys to the front door, they'd get off the school bus and they'd run home and open the door and go in. And sure, you may have a list of chores and stuff you expected for them to do, but and I'm talking about how I was raised.
Yeah.
And that as you said earlier, that paradigm has shifted. Now we're in the 2000s, we're in the 21st century, and a lot of that's changed. But I think that even though we're in the 21st century, as fathers, it's still important that we set the tone for our family, and that we are the leaders in our family. Our wives and the mothers of our children need for dads to be engaged, and they need to be the leaders of their families, and they need to provide a like you said, a constant. There needs to be a constant line of certainty in the family.
Yeah. It's funny. I'll put it this way. And again, I'm probably quoting somebody that I don't remember. Nobody stumbles into success, right?
Right.
You don't get rich by accident. You don't get a 6-pack abs by accident. You don't have a great marriage by accident. You don't have
Right.
you don't have great relationships with your kids by accident. And you could just run with that, right?
Sure.
So the cool thing about it, though, is I think that I'll put it this way, and I think a lot of people misunderstand this word authentic. If you lead authentically, it's really where it all starts. And I love this idea of, even for my kids, to define what does it mean to be authentic. So one of the things that I do a lot of, talks on is this idea of authenticity and identity and how people get it wrong. And I often ask, a crowd or a group of people, does anybody know where the term authentic came from? And of course, a lot of people kind of scratch their heads. Well,
Right.
I don't know. Well, it came from the word author, right? We didn't make us. I didn't choose my eye color. I didn't choose my taste buds. I didn't choose my skin color. I didn't choose where and when I was born.
Right.
Here's the fascinating thing is we often think that in the land of the free, home, and brave, that we get to choose everything, right? I'm free. Well, guess what? You didn't even choose your own personality. So what's fascinating is when children are 0 to, 5 or 6 years old, and I often talk about this paradigm because it's really important to understand. Kids like, names like you and me, like we're trying to be authentic all the time. They're not thinking about authenticity, right? They're not thinking, how can I be a better version of myself and all that kind of stuff, right? They're just doing their deal.
Sure.
And every single bit of their authenticity is just on display, whether it's their taste
Sure.
buds or what makes them cry or laugh. And it's different from the person next to them and the things that they gravitate to. And what happens as you get older is you start to identify, like literally write it down, your identity, right? You're writing it down,
Right.
the things that make you authentic. So what I think the best way for a father, to set the temperature in his home, and you actually brought this up earlier, this idea of seeing your kids, it's, well, what does that really mean? It really means to see and help them identify the wonder, the riches, their, all the little picadillos, their strength, and what gives them goosebumps, and all those things that make them unique, because it's
Right.
it's different from their brother or sister.
Right.
And as a dad, you get to mine for gold, in their beautiful little souls, and start to identify, and read their label for them and name those things and call those things out and get behind those things and help them to explore their authenticity and become more of themselves. And quite often in our society, though, we think that we have to generate that authenticity, right? We have to become somebody, or at least not be a nobody. And the pressure that especially teenagers feel nowadays is just insane. And I think that as fathers, we get to set the temperature in our homes by not only living authentically in ourselves, loving our kids the way that's kind of natural to us, but to let them exhale while just being themselves, and to
Right.
encourage them their own lane, as it were.
Yeah. I had a thought and then it just flew right out of my head. I guess I'll run with real life is not the same as a 30-second TikTok video or Facebook, right? There's social media has thrown up some artificial barriers for parents to overcome, because people, you have friends, everybody that's a friend of yours on Facebook is not necessarily a friend. They might be a casual acquaintance,
Sure.
but they're not necessarily your friend, and they're certainly not your best friend, right? Those are relationships that you develop away from the computer and away from social media. But social media projects a false narrative
Yeah.
that adults as well as young adults, adults of all ages, they get confused with what reality is. And it's like
Man.
you see all these stories of perfection. You see all these families, they're always on vacation, they're always buying new cars, they're always going on cruises, and their kids are perfect and they're winning all the accolades and awards,
Yeah.
but you don't see the garbage on the other side of the screen, right? You don't see the screaming arguments at 3 o'clock in the morning or none of that stuff, and
Yeah.
so it's important that when I talk about children being seen, I think I'm remembering what I was thinking about. I had to learn, and I never really perfected it, but I had to learn how to demonstrate love towards my children,
Mm.
right? And because my dad never did that for me. The only time my dad interacted with me was when he was doling out punishment
Mm.
for my misdeeds, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And
rough.
so I was still learning how to be a dad. I was still learning how to be a young man, right?
Sure.
And I was having to undo years of for better or worse damage that was done to me,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. It's pretty
And
common.
and so I was learning how to be an authentic young man, right? And I was learning how to build a new identity,
Yeah.
and I had to understand that I didn't have to be perfect. I just needed to be me, right? And I needed to do the best I could with what I had at the moment, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew when my kids, Chuck Swindoll, and who is that child psychologist? Oh my goodness, I can't think of his name.
James Dobson.
James Dobson. So as a Christian, as a Christ follower, my wife are both believers, and we go to church, and we try to live a life that's becoming of a life of faith. And so I knew that I needed to listen to James Dobson and unlearn the garbage that I was raised by
Sure.
and with, and I had to learn how to see my children, and I needed to be emotionally present in their lives and to demonstrate love towards them. Did I figure it out? Probably not. Did I try? Yes, absolutely. I did try. Knew that I had to be transparent with them, and I had to learn how to say I'm sorry. When I reacted to them or with them in a way that my father would have reacted to me, in anger or in frustration or whatever, I had to learn how to take a breath. And sometimes you just have to let the situation cool down over a period of hours or maybe a day or two,
Yeah.
and then revisit it and go, hey, this is what happened. This is how I perceived that I responded. And I'm sorry I did that because that was wrong of me. Right. And I think,
It takes a lot of guts, and that takes a really deep level of authenticity to do that. So,
right.
yeah.
And I think dads need to understand that it's okay to say I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to be human, right? We're all human. We're not perfect. No matter what kind of image in your head you may have of what a perfect father is. Well, our example of what a father is God the Father and Jesus. And we see what he did for the woman at the well and all these different Bible stories and things of how he handled other people and how he demonstrated love towards them. He didn't accept or condone or engage in sin or pat them on the back for being stupid, but he loved them and he appreciated them, and he showed them that God loved them and that they had value, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
showed them a different way. And I think that that's probably the best example that dads have when it comes to engaging with their children, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I think that saying, I'm sorry piece is huge. In fact, we have on our wall in the hallway, we have kind of like a stencil that says, in our family, and the first thing is we do I'm sorries. That's the first one. And it's, it's absolutely vital. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think that there's, so many, of course, examples, right? The real stories that happen are those in which, Jesus, God in the flesh, looked at someone and didn't condemn them, but he said, hey, you're missing the mark.
Right.
You're missing the mark. Let's go do this together. Come with me.
Especially the religious people.
Yeah, right.
Those who are striving to live a perfect example, a religious, all these rules. If you're going to be like God, you have to obtain perfection through all of these rules, right?
Mm.
You look at the Old Testament, we all screwed up horribly. Mankind in general screwed up horribly, right? That's why there's grace. That's why Jesus hung on the cross. That's why God sent himself to the cross so he could redeem us from all of that silliness, right? And stupidity and vanity and
And it's, I remember my pastor said one time, he said that Christians not only repent of their sin, but of their righteousness. And it's amazing how our righteousness, right? If we think that it's, Jesus Christ plus my good works, well, what is that really saying? That it's what he did is not complete. And then I start focusing on all this behavior and extrinsic type of, behavior, and it just starts to crush us because we cannot live up to it.
right. And we start comparing our quote unquote best behavior with our neighbors.
Right.
Well, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I don't go out and carouse, chase women until 3 o'clock in the morning, and I always come home, after work and prop up my feet and drink a beer and flip the channels while the wife's doing all the work in the kitchen and tending to the children. And, I think it's part of human nature to compare ourselves to others, and to, it's like you said, our acts of righteousness, which are, like filthy rags in the eyes of God, there was only one righteous person, and we hung him on the cross, so that whole that whole story is like, yep, that's humanity. That's exactly who we were and who we are, left to our own devices, right? That's why it's important that we love our kids and we try to provide the best example that we can for them.
Yeah, and I think that the term grace means unmerited favor, and sometimes we think that the word unmerited stands by itself, but it's actually the favor that matters. And I think that we as dads, when our children understand that you are the object of my delight, I love you just like so much that it hurts. And I mean, they really need to understand the depth of our favor towards them. And it's amazing what happens in a relationship, when the children understand that, man, dad is for me like a hurricane. I can't get away from him. He's just always for me. And that type of a relationship long into adulthood creates such a team, effort, right? In fact, I had T-shirts made a few years ago for Christmas. My last name is ASK, like ask. It's pronounced Osk, in fact. So I actually had Team Osk, shirts made. In fact, my hat says, Osk on it. But I always wanted my kids to know that, man, if we sink together, right? If we win, we win together. And I want them to know that no matter what, I am absolutely for them like a hurricane.
And what's the best way that a dad can demonstrate that to the children and a living example is how you treat your wife.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
You love and respect your wife, and you treat her as the best thing in your life, right? And that's how young boys and young men learn how to treat women. Is they have an example of a father at home who doesn't beat his mother, that is not an alcoholic, doesn't treat her irreverently through verbal abuse. There's physical abuse, there's domestic abuse, takes on many colors, and emotional abuse is sometimes even worse than physical abuse. And so it's I think it's paramount that dads revisit that marital relationship and do everything in their power to make that as strong as possible. Yeah. And that's why you go to retreats and stuff. Your churches have a couple retreats, whatever they call them.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
good.
Marriage retreats, all kinds of stuff. And I think too, right? I think there's a lot of people that their definition of success is do no harm. But I'll be honest. I think that indifference or just this, okay, at least I wasn't mean. That's not success.
Right.
I want Lisa to understand that I am thrilled with her.
Right.
I mean, the more I love her with, the same, hopefully the similar love that God gives me, right? In of course, a broken way. she shines, and
Sure.
it just makes the entire family better. But I'm with you. I think the number one way to love our children is to love our spouses.
Yep. It's an example that's needed horribly
Yeah.
in our families. In the family, the world that we're living in right now, families is not the nuclear. It's not the nuclear family. It's not the bedrock of our society anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and the proof's in the pudding too. Everything's kind of falling apart because of it.
Right. And I remember, I didn't become a Christian until I was like 17 years old. And that's a whole other story. But I remember as I was becoming a young adult and exploring my faith and growing in wisdom with regards to God's word and the people I was listening to, Chuck Swindoll and James Dobson and Billy Graham and other warriors of faith that are out there. Either, Billy Graham's not with us anymore, but Franklin Graham's there. And so there are people that we look up to and we hopefully can learn from so that we can grow inside as people, and that growth hopefully in turn, we fill our cup, and then we can turn around and we can let that love and that knowledge and that wisdom leak out towards our family.
Sure. Yeah, well said. Yeah.
All right, here's some example questions. How do identity and authenticity influence parenting adult children?
I think that again, to understand those words is paramount, right? And we talked about that earlier, right? Authenticity is just identifying what the author put in you that's different from the person next to you. But that entails things like, your values, right? Your convictions, your virtues. Those are different things. And most people don't understand that.
Right.
What are your strengths and how do you want to apply those things? What is it that gives you goosebumps? What is it that breaks your heart? What problem do you want to solve? Like what makes you just furious? And when you start to, again, identify those things, literally write them down, and then maybe put those in a hierarchy, it's amazing what rises to the top for everybody. So I think that, they need to be understood and they need to be identified. And it's amazing when you start operating your life through that lens, right? You start to feel natural because you've identified you. And if you start to operate your life, for instance, through your values, it's amazing how much more grit you can experience and resilience, this idea of bouncing back, because you don't have just this whitewashed, vague understanding of who's showing up to the problem.
Right. Describe your approach to teaching resilience to young adults. That's a good one.
Yeah, so we do have some coursework and so on for young adults, but mainly we really like to teach the parents and other adults, to identify these things for themselves, because you really can't teach something you don't understand.
Right.
And I really, really believe in leadership. So whether you're a parent, a coach, a pastor, mentor, you have to understand these things for yourself first, and then you can, start mining for gold in younger people.
So when you say teaching resilience, what does that mean?
So, kind of a definition of terms. So grit and resilience, why are they different? So resilience is this idea of bouncing back quickly, right? You get knocked down, you get up quicker. If you're resilient, right, you get up quicker. If you're not resilient, you get knocked down, right? It might take you weeks to kind of recover from whatever comment or job loss or whatever that hardship was.
Gotcha.
And grit is best understood by this idea that you're doing something over a long period of time that's difficult, because what's on the other side of the difficulty is worth fighting for, right? You have staying power. But I think it's really important to understand when you do that from an intrinsically motivated place, right, your values and things like that, it's amazing how much grit and resilience are generated. But if you're doing it from an extrinsically motivated place, like people pleasing or shame or embarrassment or things like that, it's easy to kind of falter and hide.
Well, that's also one of the ways that we teach that sort of thing is by showcasing it in our lives, right? Yeah. That's the best, most authentic way that we can do that.
Yeah, for sure.
What key differences exist between grit and resilience? You already said that. You already explained that. Explain starting with who and understanding family dynamics.
Yeah, so I love the idea that, there's a lot of people that say you have to have a strong why. Your why is what matters. Truth of the matter is I agree with that. But what if your why is your brother's why? What if your why is your dad's why? What if your why is James Moffat's why? What if your why is Joe Rogan's why?
Right.
So this idea of who, when you really dig down into who you are authentically, then your why becomes your why.
Gotcha. How do you define and cultivate an uncrushable spirit in children?
I think it goes back to, this idea that, love, right? My kids, I need to identify, forgive me, the uncrushable spirit in our children, comes from, this bedrock of love, right? This safety net that, you can do nothing that's going to remove my delight in you, my love for you, right? It's unconditional. And then also coupling that with introducing to themselves, those intrinsic qualities that are powerful and precious and good. And it's amazing how the support and love coupled with authenticity and identity are an absolute recipe for success.
Amen. I appreciate that. I like what you bring to the table.
Oh,
and David, thank you for being here and being on our podcast episode today.
It's a pleasure.
And to my listening audience, I'm going to say thank you for the privilege of your time. You can listen to this podcast episode on Apple Podcasts, Activate FM, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Public Radio. And I upload the video podcast episode to Rumble. That's Rumble. It's a conservative alternative to YouTube. You can go to parentingadultchildren.org. That's my website, parentingadultchildren.org. And you can see my contact information. You can send me an email. You can leave me a voicemail. You can see an upcoming show schedule if you go to the blog. I always list 2 months in advance as who's going to be on and when. And there's a place for you to click on a review. And if you like a specific podcast episode, please leave us a review. You can do that if you're on your iPhone and you're listening to Apple Podcasts, you can do that right there from your iPhone. I release a new episode every Friday morning at 8 a.m. And thank you again for the privilege of your time. And everybody have a wonderful day. And David, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Please tune in next week for another episode of our podcast on parenting adult children.
If you are the parent, mentor, friend, or relative of a young adult in recovery, please listen closely for about 90 seconds. I have some very important information for you. The current treatment system has become a revolving door, relapse-ridden mess with well under a 20% success rate. It doesn't matter who's measuring it. My name is Richard Jones, and I have spent the better part of my 38-year career working with the families of young adults in recovery. Now, I am talking about young adults, 17 to 25, with substance abuse issues or trouble with the law. They may need rehab, they may be currently in treatment, or they may be finishing a detox program. They may be heading toward jail or being released soon. Most recovery programs are forced and sterile. They ignore your child's natural strengths and abilities and their biggest advantage, you. Now, the 3 biggest problems we can solve for your family right now. First, by accident or design, the system is built on a relapse model. It offers a Band-Aid that is designed to keep you coming back instead of killing the source of the relapse at its roots. Secondly, it's built on a model of guilt and shame in order to assign blame to you and your child instead of fixing the real problem. See, the system is financially abusive. Tens of thousands of dollars that will not guarantee one result, just a promise that you can try over and over again if you live long enough. Now, it's very important for you to understand, with the right kind of determined outcome support and a clear roadmap, you can get a relapse-proof recovery without humiliation, without guilt, or being financially abused. You can also start seeing results immediately. No more blind faith reliance on an indifferent, reluctant, or burnout practitioner. You can finally take advantage of a method that works with your young adult strengths and abilities. Let us show you the only lasting way to recovery instead of the same old failed methods that most treatment systems use without regard to result or to your family's future. If you are the type of family who will not take no for an answer, the kind of family who can't afford to lose someone they lose, please consider this: stopping the frustration and fighting right away. Exchanging embarrassment for pride and bragging, and saying no to being financially victimized with no promises whatsoever. If this sounds like the kind of recovery effort you and your young adult deserve, give us your name and best email address below for more information. You can also go to secondstarts.com. That's the number 2, NDSTARTS.com, and book a free 15-minute call. There is a better way for the people who care more.